Right now, there's no shortage of things to react to. There's headlines, conflicts, sudden shifts in the narrative. And most of it moves so fast that by the time I try and understand one thing, something else seems to replace it. And I imagine most people stop trying to understand altogether, not out of ignorance, but out of exhaustion. And when that happens, you don't just lose clarity, you lose track of what actually matters. And when everything feels scattered like this, that's usually when patterns matter the most. Not to predict what happens next, but to understand what's actually happening underneath it. And what draws me to this is trying to understand money, the transition happening within global finance, and where crypto fits into all of that. But right now, those things feel like they're running on parallel tracks. And the war keeps pulling me and pulling my attention. And whether I like it or not, there's no way to fully understand money and power without at least acknowledging what is happening around it. I wish it wasn't true, but here we are. Most people, I think, close their laptop, and I absolutely understand that. But I don't. And if you're new here, this is what this channel is. I start with XRP, not to predict price, but to understand how this technology actually works. And by staying with that lens long enough, it's no longer just learning about crypto. It has become the beginning of seeing the financial system itself. So let's look underneath the noise together. Because this week, across geopolitics, digital finance, and public trust, there are patterns which I think are worth paying attention to. So let's start with the elephant in the room, and let's start with Iran, because it's impossible to ignore right now. And honestly, it might be the clearest example this week of the difference between noise and signal. Within the same news cycle, we went from threats to strike Iran's power plants to announcements of peace negotiations. And before anyone could make sense of any of it, Iran's parliament speaker came out and denied that any negotiations had taken place at all, called it an effort to manipulate financial and oil markets, and even that the US was talking to itself. And the bombing continues. And here's what actually stopped me. The United States, the most powerful country in the world, said publicly that it wasn't sure who was even running Iran at the current moment. The exact words were, all of their leaders are dead, as far as we know. Just sit with that for just a second. We're in a conflict with a country, and we don't know who we're negotiating with, or if we're even negotiating at all. And I want to be really clear here. I'm not coming at this from a particular side. I'm not rooting for an outcome. I'm just trying to understand and stand in the middle and actually look at what's happening. And from that perspective, there's no clear mission. There's no consistent answer to why we're here, what winning looks like. It keeps shifting, and every time it feels like there's a thread to follow, it almost disappears. A month ago, there were negotiation frameworks in place. Now we're here. And in between that, it's not clear what changed for the people actually living inside of all of this. Not there, not here. And it's not just Iran. We're also hearing about bombings in Ecuador, oil restrictions in Cuba, reports of underwater internet cables in the Middle East, the infrastructure that carries the global internet potentially being at risk. Every week, the frame seems to get bigger. Every day, something new is added before the last thing seems to be resolved. And no one is clearly pointing to what escalation actually looks like from here, or what the consequences might be. And when you turn to the people responsible for explaining this, you get the United States Treasury Secretary on national television saying, sometimes you have to escalate in order to de-escalate. And then, in the middle of all of that, there was a press conference at Elvis Presley's estate. The President of the United States signing a guitar. And I'm not saying that to be dismissive. I'm saying it because the contrast itself tells you something about the weight that feels like is at stake right now and the atmosphere surrounding the decisions that are being made. Meanwhile, underneath all of this, the world keeps moving. India quietly purchased Iranian oil at war market price, something that likely wouldn't have happened before any of this. And because of that, Iran is bringing in more money than it was before the conflict escalated. Not because anyone designed it that way, but because countries are making practical decisions regardless of the noise. And that's the signal underneath all of this. Other countries aren't waiting for American clarity. Egypt, Pakistan, and Turkey are now brokering conversations, passing messages back and forth because someone has to. The vacuum doesn't stay empty. It just gets filled by someone else. And the clearest example of that this week didn't come from an adversary. It came from one of America's closest allies. Japan's Prime Minister came to Washington, D.C. for a state visit, a visit many say turned from celebration into a snub. And within days, not months, not weeks, but days, Japan agreed to pay for oil in the Chinese yuan to secure passage through the Strait of Hormuz. And publicly, Japan declined to stand with America on its positioning of the war. That's the pattern. That's the signal. And when you step back, this is the question that sticks with me. America is 250 years old as a country. Iran is a civilization thousands of years old. It is shaped by religion, identity, and sovereignty. And yet, it feels like decisions made by a few people are now rippling across the entire world. In oil prices, in internet infrastructure, and diplomatic relationships, and trust. And I keep coming back to one question. Not who wins, but what does the world do with what it is watching? Because that question is what connects everything else that we're about to look at. And I want to be clear about something before we go further. Nothing I said in the last portion comes from dismissing the United States. The US still leads the world within finance. The institutions that oversee how money moves, not just domestically, but globally, they sit inside the United States. And what's important to understand is this. Government doesn't move as one thing. It moves as many things at once. And while one part of it may appear to some as loud, chaotic, and hard to look at, another part has been moving quietly. And what it's doing deserves quite a bit of attention. Because while all of that noise was happening this week, something significant shifted quietly, without a headline that matched the weight of it. On March 17th, just last week, the SEC and the CFTC issued a joint statement together, and what they outlined was a clear framework for how certain crypto assets may be treated under US law. After years of uncertainty, after years of builders not knowing whether what they were creating would be treated as legal, regulated, or something in between, they started to draw a line. Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, XRP, and 12 other major cryptocurrencies, for the first time, have formally been recognized by both the SEC and the CFTC as digital commodities, not securities. And this is still an interpretation, not yet permanent law. The Clarity Act would actually make it binding. But the agencies didn't wait for Congress. They drew the line themselves. And that signal from the two most powerful financial regulators in the world acting together is not nothing. Now, let me explain why this distinction matters without putting you to sleep. The SEC oversees investments, stocks, securities, things people buy, expecting them to increase in value over time. The CFTC oversees commodities, things like oil, gold, wheat, things with independent market utility. The difference in how those two categories are regulated is significant. The difference is the difference between being watched like a suspect and being treated like a market participant. And for years, crypto has been sitting in an uncomfortable gray zone where enforcement could come from either side at either time or any time. What's changing now is that the boundaries are becoming clearer. Not perfectly defined, but clearer than they've ever been before. And I want to be honest with you about how I reacted when I saw this. My first response was not excitement. I've been in this space long enough that good news can turn and start to feel like background noise. There's always something around the corner. A ruling, a decision, a moment that's supposed to change everything. And the market barely reacts. But when I slowed down and actually looked at this felt different. Because it's not a rumor, it's not a prediction. It's two major regulatory bodies putting forward a shared direction and saying, in effect, the uncertainty is starting to narrow. That is infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't care how you feel about it. It doesn't need excitement. It just gets built. Now, the Clarity Act, which would formalize parts of this into law, is still moving through the Senate. And right now, it's slowed down by one specific tension. And I want to explain that really simply because it connects directly to this next part. The tension is around stablecoin yields. And here's what that means. A savings account pays you interest for keeping your money inside of it. A stablecoin is essentially a digital representation of a dollar, designed to hold a stable value while moving on blockchain infrastructure. The question now being debated is this: should that digital dollar be allowed to generate yield the same way your bank account does? Banks are pushing back because if a digital dollar can offer comparable or better returns, it changes where people choose to keep their money. That tension is real. And it's the same tension that's about to show up somewhere else through a completely different entry point. So, now let's talk about the door that just opened. And I mean literally just opened. In early March, just a few weeks ago, X, the platform most of us still call Twitter, started rolling out a beta of something called X Money. And before I get into why I think it matters, I just want to slow down for a second and look at what it actually is. There's yield on deposits, a debit card, peer-to-peer payments, all sitting inside of an app that already has hundreds of millions of users. And I had this moment when I was reading it where I realized this isn't just a crypto wallet. This isn't some niche fintech thing. This is starting to look like a bank, just not called one. And it's being built inside of a social platform. Elon Musk has been pretty direct about his ambitions. He said, when I say payments, I mean someone's entire life or entire financial life. And I keep coming back to that sentence because I don't think it's just aimed at people who are deep into tech. I think it's aimed at anyone who's starting to feel friction in the systems that they're already inside of. And I don't know how you feel, but when I look around right now, it feels like people are making trade-offs constantly. This bill or that one. This necessity or that one. And at a certain point, even something like a bank account can start to feel like friction. There's minimums, fees, penalties for not having enough. And when that happens, people don't make some big statement about leaving. They just start looking for something easier, quietly. And I think some of them are going to find it within X Money. And that feels like a different kind of shift. Not just people who were excluded from traditional banking because of lack of global access, but people choosing to step outside because something feels easier. And then there's another layer to all of this. And this is the part that made me pause just a bit. Because payment systems don't just move money. They shape what can actually be paid. Not just what exists, but what's allowed to exist economically. And there's a gap there because between what's publicly acceptable and between what's publicly acceptable and what clearly has attention and demand. And for a long time, that gap has been managed through friction. Certain kinds of work, even when they're legal, even when there's demand, don't have clean, direct ways to get paid. Take, for instance, adult content creators are probably the clearest example of that. And I'm not saying this for shock value. I'm saying it because it's clear. And not even to turn into an advocate for adult content creators, but because the payment layer around it has always been complicated, restricted, indirect, and the behavior or desire for it never disappears. It just gets pushed into systems that can support it. But when you remove that friction, when money can move instantly in small amounts, directly between people, that gap doesn't stay contained anymore. It starts to close. And what was previously constrained becomes economically viable. And once something becomes viable, it scales, quietly at first, and then very quickly. And why I see this in particular as somewhat of a Trojan horse in America is that from my experience and perspective, our culture presents itself as a Christian nation with high moral order. But many times those values don't always translate to people's actions behind closed doors. And when you make those actions easier with less friction, I believe you open a door or even a tidal wave comes in. And that's part is that part I don't think people are truly taking into account yet. And when I step back and look at this next part, and when I step back and look at this next to everything we just talked about, the regulation, the tension around yields, it starts to feel like something else is forming entirely. Because now you don't just have banks competing with banks. You have platforms starting to compete with the system itself. And when you combine that with scale, distribution, marketing, and direct access to people, it's hard not to see this as positioning. And maybe I'm wrong about that, but it's the pattern I keep coming back to. Because trust isn't built as a feature on a list. It's something that is built from how something shows up. When people are paying attention, and right now, people are paying attention. And this week, in the middle of all the noise, Elon Musk floated the idea of personally funding TSA officers to return to work. Whether that happens or not, I'll leave for you to decide what that means. But what it signals to people who only read headlines, in my opinion, is care, safety, stability. And that signal, whether it's intentional or not, lands on top of a payment platform about to ask those same people to trust it with their financial lives. I'm not telling you what to think about Elon Musk. I'm just showing you the pattern. Before Donald Trump took office, banks refused to loan him money. Talks of him even being debanked were floated. Trump has been clear he wants America to be the king of crypto. And now, Elon Musk, a once right-hand man, is getting into the fight with X money as his gloves. Stablecoin yields versus banks. I'm just watching and observing and taking notes. So let's zoom out, all the way out. Because underneath everything we've talked about today, the war, the whiplash, the regulatory framework quietly being built, the payment platform about to open a door for millions of people, there is a question that I keep coming back to underneath all of the confusion. Is there something forming? And I think the honest answer is yes, absolutely. But not in the way that gets announced loudly, not in the way that makes headlines, not in a global summit or a press conference or a signing ceremony. It's forming the way things actually change, quietly, practically, one decision at a time. Look at what other countries are doing right now. Not what they're saying, but what they're actually doing. They're making new trade deals. They're refusing to follow America into conflicts that they don't agree with. They're buying oil at war market price from countries that they were not supposed to buy from a month ago. They're stepping into diplomatic vacuums because someone has to. Not because they made a dramatic declaration about the death of American dominance, but because the pressure has simply become too consistent to keep ignoring. And here's what I think is important to understand. The move away from dollar dependence, if it's happening, won't look like a revolution. It won't look like anything at first. What I think it will look like is a trade deal here, a bilateral agreement there, a quiet decision by a treasury somewhere in the world to hold a little less of one thing and a little more of another. And by the time it becomes visible enough to make the news, it will already be done. That's the pattern underneath the noise. And then there's this. The richest man in the world is about to embed a payment system into one of the most used social platforms on earth. 600 million users, a Visa partnership, FDIC insurance, 6% yield, peer-to-peer payments, stock trading, crypto wallet, and eventually, whether it's confirmed yet or not, the architecture is clearly being built with more in mind than just sending $20 to your friend. For X money to become what Musk says he wants it to become, someone's entire financial life, it has to grow beyond American borders. It has to interact with other systems, other currencies, other financial infrastructures. And those interactions, quiet, transactional, practical, they won't be announced at a summit. They'll just happen. Because that's how money moves. Not with declarations, with utility. And when hundreds of millions of people have the ability to start moving money across borders in new ways, across new platforms, between new systems, outside the traditional banking rails that they grew up with, something has to settle those payments. Something that works in the background, that's invisible, neutral, fast, without taking a side or favoring one currency over another. That's not a futuristic idea. That's just how systems work. And there are rails that are being built right now for exactly this moment. This is where I come back to where this channel actually started. XRP, Ripple, a technology that was never really about price. It was always about infrastructure, about being the neutral settlement layer for a world that was eventually going to need one, quietly, practically, without announcement. And here's what I've been thinking about. One of the reasons crypto has never fully taken off or gained mass adoption or never reached the mainstream in the way the technology I think deserves is because everyday people had no practical reason to touch it, no utility that felt personal and immediate, no door that felt like it was meant for them. X money might be that door for hundreds of millions of people who have never thought about blockchain once in their lives, who just want a better savings rate, who just want to send money without a fee, who just want access to things the current system told them that they couldn't have. And I'm not saying that there's a connection between X money and XRP, at least not yet. But when those people walk through that door, they won't know what's settling their transactions underneath. They won't need to. That's the whole point. The best infrastructure is invisible. But we will know because we've been watching the current the entire time. That's what this channel is. That's why I'm here. And that's why no matter how loud the noise gets, I don't close my laptop. Thank you for taking the time to join me. My name is James Harris. This is Layer 1. And please like, subscribe, leave a comment if any of this resonated with you. If you want to start a conversation, I answer all the comments. But thanks for joining me. And until the next episode, have a great evening. Bye.